What's going on, dudes? So what do you all think about Tom Kalinske? I've been thinking about Sega's Golden Boy a lot lately because 1, I'm rereading Console Wars with my oldest son, and 2, thanks to the popularity of that book and the documentary that debuted on Paramount Plus, which totally stole their logo from the Console Wars YouTube channel, by the way, old Tom Kalinske's been popping up all over my YouTube feed for years. It seems like every YouTube channel with over 1,000 subs, and sometimes less than that, has managed to get an interview out of this guy. And Tom Kalinske is always game to tell basically the same exact story about how he saved Sega in the 90s, put Nintendo in its place, and then left because jealous executives at SEGA of Japan stopped cooperating with SEGA of America. What's that? Who's Tom Kalinske? Come on, dude, you know him. He was president and CEO of SEGA of America from October 1990 to July 1996. And even though I was like a preteen at the time, I totally remember images of the smiling blonde toy executive mugging the camera with Sonic the Hedgehog. Like a lot of kids, I read the gaming magazines and Kalinske was all over them. Some magazines had swimsuit models. We had Lara Croft and Tom Kalinske. Ooh, baby. Tom Kalinske rose to fame and fortune as a hotshot toy executive at Mattel, the makers of He-Man and Barbie, and according to industry legend, he was pivotal in making those brands successful in the 80s. But dissatisfied with how he was treated by Mattel's board of directors, Kalinske left, spent some time with Matchbox, and was eventually headhunted by Sega Enterprises to be the new president and CEO of SEGA of America, because the current president of SEGA of America had spent tens of millions of dollars on endless celebrity endorsements that didn't do much to get the American public interested in the Sega Genesis. Genesis. It does what Nintendo don't, and that's gather dust on store shelves. Tom Kalinske's story about how this went down is as fascinating as it is preposterous. According to Kalinske, and therefore Console Wars, which as a book is almost entirely dependent upon private interviews, Tom Kalinske and his wife and kids were vacationing in Hawaii, and he was lying on a beach no less, when a Japanese businessman in a suit and tie approached him with a proposition. It was Hayao Nakayama, the president of Sega, and he had managed to hunt down Tom Kalinske in person on a beach. He didn't send someone, he didn't leave a message or call Kalinske's home or office. He had the time to go to the beach the man was laying on and comb through what was, no doubt, hundreds of people and just found Tom Kalinske lying there, like a real-life Where's Waldo. Come on, dude, that's just silly. How did Nakayama know Kalinske was in Hawaii? How did he know which beach he'd be on at any given moment, such that he could just walk up to him? What if the family went to lunch? What if they decided to use the hotel pool instead? I know Hawaii seems little, but it's actually huge. Kalinske could have been anywhere and doing anything: fishing, golfing, playing Super Hang-On. The possibilities are endless. Further, who bothers a man while he's on vacation? And why would the president of Sega do it personally? Was he on vacation too? I mean, just the thought of a guy in a suit walking around on the sand. Did he bother to take off his shoes first? Or afterwards, did he have to go and dump out all the sand? So anyway, Hayao Nakayama explains he's desperate, and that for some reason he thinks Tom Kalinske the only man in the world who can save the day. Kalinske likes the challenge and agrees to head SEGA of America, but only after he's seen the Sega Game Gear. Another funny aspect of this story is the image of Tom Kalinske immediately going to Japan with Nakayama so he can see what Sega Research and Development's up to and decide whether or not he wants the job. And there he gets to see a prototype for the Sega Game Gear, and it impresses him enough to want to join Sega. Now, I like the Game Gear, but there's a lot of irony in this story because 1, the Game Gear had a lot of technical problems, such as a horrible battery life and a pretty crappy screen, and 2, those technical problems prevented the Game Gear from being very successful. It reveals to me how much appearances seem to matter to Tom Kalinske and how unimportant the details were to him. It's like he saw it and he said, "Yeah, I can sell this," and that's it. So what did Tom Kalinske do exactly while he was at Sega? We keep asking ourselves that even after reading the book. The thing is, SEGA of America's main job at the time was simply to import, market, and distribute Sega products that were developed and manufactured in Japan. When Kalinske arrived, the Genesis had already been in stores for years. They were on the verge of releasing the Game Gear and the Sega CD, and they were already far into development on the original Sonic the Hedgehog. This is crucial because it's Sonic the Hedgehog that Kalinske's most known for, even though he had very little say regarding any aspect of the game outside of how it was marketed. There's another story that's often retold, again chiefly by Kalinske himself, to the effect that when Sonic was being shown around to SEGA of America that the character was in a very unappealing state, and that he was too edgy, and that he had fangs and a hot girlfriend named Madonna. And so SEGA of America's marketing team allegedly proposed a redesign of the character to render him safer and more appealing to American kids. The obvious upshot of this story is that it implies Kalinske and his team are partly responsible for the widespread appeal of Sonic in 1991.
Again, Kalinske seems very concerned with appearances, but not necessarily details. The problem is, Sonic the Hedgehog was released in June of 1991. Kalinske started at Sega in October of 1990. It seems plausible that Sega could have altered the design of Sonic at some point in time, very early in Tom Kalinske's time at Sega, but it's a little hard to believe that Kalinske's misgivings would have led to a substantial change to the character at that point. Sonic was the result of a couple years worth of work and revision at Sega of Japan, as the company worked toward the goal of producing a charismatic mascot that could compete with Mario. By 1990, the game's mechanics and engine were largely worked out, and Naoto Oshima, a designer at Sega working on the project, eventually produced character designs for a ball-like hedgehog that were ultimately incorporated into the game. And if you go back and examine all of Oshima's earliest concept art and drawings of the character, all of which most certainly predates anything Tom Kalinske would have seen between the winter of 1990 and the spring of 1991, you'll see that Oshima's renderings of Sonic are more or less exactly the same as what's found in the final game. There's no edge, no meanness, and no fangs. These early drawings of Sonic show that the character was designed to be round and even Mickey Mouse-like from the very beginning. It's possible that the image Tom Kalinske saw was meant to be promotional, like a mock-up that pulled Sonic out of the character that he was playing in the game. And it's possible that the fangs he saw were those of a common manga trope, in which fangs ironically are added to emphasize the cuteness of a character. But what's not possible is that any of Kalinske's objections regarding Sonic's character design could have had any effect on the actual final product. Because, as I've said, the oldest concept art demonstrates that what Oshima drew is what wound up in the final game. I don't want to accuse Kalinske of lying, but I think it's possible that over time, his memories about his reaction to Sonic's look could have become exaggerated. It definitely plays into the narrative of Tom Kalinske's role as the savior of Sega. So it's easy to see a motive here. Kalinske wants to be associated with Sonic's success, and that part of the story is certainly true. Cut. This is John. I'm going to go ahead and just insert myself into the middle of this video because I was poking around and I found evidence suggesting that Tom Kalinske's marketing team really did reject Sonic. But the alternative story I found is not quite identical, so I think it's worth mentioning. In an interview with Ken Horowitz at Sega 16 back in 2006, Mark Cerny, the founder of the Sega Technical Institute and a key figure in the development of Sonic 2, confirms that such an exchange between Sega of America and Sega of Japan over Sonic's character design actually in fact happened. After Cerny showed conceptual drawings of Sonic from Japan with Sega of America, he said it took months, but he finally heard that Sega of America's marketing team was livid, and that they thought the character was an unsalvageable disaster. And they even made a list of do's and don'ts that they sent to Japan to prevent future mistakes. What's fascinating is that in Mark Cerny's version of the story, no suggestions are made regarding fixing the character. It's just more like Sega of America dismissed Sonic as a lost cause at that point, which was obviously wrong in the long run. Cerny also says that Sega of America originally rejected the idea for Sonic 2, since they thought it was too soon for a sequel. Anyway, it's interesting how people can tell different versions of the same story. I think Kalinske's wrong about making suggestions that fixed Sonic. Sonic didn't really change that much, from conception to execution, not substantially, and not according to Kalinske's description, except for the Madonna girlfriend thing, but I'm not sure she was ever meant to be in the game. Anyway, at the same time, it's hard for me to believe Cerny's take that Sega of America thought the character was an unsalvageable disaster. If that were true, then it's unlikely that Kalinske and his team would have pushed to make Sonic the pack-in game for the Genesis. Obviously, he thought the game and character were exceptional. Cynically, I can't help but think that what really happened is that SEGA of America gave SEGA of Japan harsh criticism in order to let them know that SEGA of America was paying attention and that they weren't just going to do whatever SEGA of Japan said without their own creative input being heard. I think it's likely that SEGA of America liked the character and they just wanted justification to retain some modicum of creative control, or at least a veto when it came to decisions made in Japan. In other words, this whole episode was political, and perhaps Kalinski's story about how his team improved the character is also political. On both accounts, the end result is to make Kalinske look essential, but that's my cynical interpretation. Anyway, back to the story. Tom Kalinske's most famous and greatest moment was his first big meeting with the Japanese board of directors at SEGA, where he proposed a 4-point plan in order to help SEGA successfully promote the Genesis in the United States, to turn the console into a multi-million selling hit capable of competing with Nintendo. 1. As I've just said, Kalinske wanted Sonic the Hedgehog to be the pack-in game for the Sega Genesis, and he wanted it at no additional cost. Funny enough, his argument at the time was less about how good Sonic was, and more about how religious people in America might object to the supernatural imagery of Altered Beast, the original pack-in game for the console. Again, Kalinske was always more concerned about the image that's projected, and not necessarily the quality of the content or the details. 2. He wanted the price of the Genesis lowered to $150, down from $189. 3. He wanted to market the Sega Genesis to teens and young adults. Let Nintendo have the kids, which contradicts his reasoning for wanting Sonic as the pack-in game. Hey, don't look at me. This is all according to Tom Kalinske's version of the story. 4. And he wanted games to be more tailored to an American audience. And much more, he wanted a massive expansion of SEGA of America's staff and product development department. In other words, he wanted SEGA of America to develop more games too. And if I'm not mistaken, this last point would see the creation of the Sega Technical Institute in 1991, which would be headed by Mike Cerny and would be for a long time the home office of Yuji Naka, the head programmer of Sonic the Hedgehog and the genius game designer famous for seminal classics like Choo Choo Rocket and Ballin' Wonderland. Anyway, SEGA of Japan allegedly hated Tom Kalinske's 4-point strategy, probably because 3 out of 4 of his points were tantamount to losing or spending a lot more money on a console that was already bleeding money. Thanks to lower than expected sales and heavy spending on celebrity endorsements, Michael Jackson, Buster Douglas, Joe Montana, Tommy Lasorda, acquiring rights to Spider-Man, all of this and the related TV ads were very expensive. And now Kalinske wanted to spend even more money? And worse, he was gonna cut whatever revenue was being made for the Sega Genesis by an additional $50 a console. But Kalinske believed in this. He knew that if he lowered the price of the Genesis substantially, that a lot more people were gonna actually buy it. You see, Kalinske, like a lot of old dudes who went to business school in the 20th century, believed in the so-called Gillette strategy. The Gillette razor company famously sold their razors at a loss in order to sell their replacement blades for a profit. By getting the consumer invested in your product through a relatively low threshold, you could then just, f them. What's goofy to me here is that old Japanese men also go to business school and they also know the Gillette strategy. Indeed, as with the Nintendo Famicom, which was sold at a loss for the very same reason. The Sega Genesis was probably already being sold at a significant loss between 1988 and 1990. What Kalinske was proposing was a much greater financial risk than what SEGA of Japan had anticipated. But on top of that, Kalinske wanted to effectively give away the best game SEGA of Japan had developed for the Genesis so far, Sonic the Hedgehog. It was like he was suggesting they sell the razor at a loss and then give away the blades too. Expanding funding for SEGA of America to establish the Sega Research Institute was probably also a hard sell. Again, it was tantamount to pouring out more company money onto a failing venture and then hoping for the best. And Kalinske's third point of his plan, saying that Sega ought to sell to teens and young adults, was almost an admission of defeat. Sega was in this to compete with Nintendo, not to come out and create new markets where they didn't have to compete with Nintendo. Despite all of this, according to Kalinske, Hayao Nakayama gave the American executive full support, and thanks to the 4-point plan and the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, the sales for the Sega Genesis were soon picking up speed, and even beginning to outsell Nintendo. Indeed, for several years, beginning in 1991 and through 1993, Sega would finally outsell Nintendo in terms of console sales, and by a wide margin too. Meanwhile, during this time, the new Super Nintendo was unquestionably the king in Japan, but the lower cost of the Genesis and the momentum gained by Sega forced Nintendo to play a game of catch-up in the United States, where the Super Nintendo wasn't released until late in the summer of 1991, months after the price drop, and a full 2 years after the debut of the Sega Genesis. But despite this early lead, in the long run, by the mid to late 90s, the Genesis would ultimately fall back behind the Super Nintendo in terms of total worldwide console sales. And with a $150 price tag in 1991, which was further discounted to $100 the following year, it's not exactly clear that Sega's low pricing was actually viable or sustainable for the company. Were they actually recovering their losses? Was the Gillette model of success being stretched too thin? I'm not sure that Sega in the 90s was actually more successful than Nintendo, in spite of the fact that from 1991 through 1993, they outsold Nintendo in terms of consoles. Did they sell the necessary amount of game cartridges required to offset their losses on a very low-priced Genesis? I'll say this about Sega during Tom Kalinske's years. They certainly were better than Nintendo when it came to memorable MTV generation ads, meant to make the competition look lame. And it's clear from Console Wars and all the interviews that Kalinske relishes the aggressive rise of Sega from underdog to the coolest kid in school. But it's unfortunate for those of us seeking out a more complete image of the truth that Kalinske's enthusiastic interviewers never have the balls to ask about Tom Kalinske's litany of failures. During his time at Sega from late 1990 to 1996, Sega released an impressive collection of failed hardware, most of which probably never turned much of a profit. And most of these ambitious and ill-fated contraptions can't be blamed on Kalinske. He was at heart an old-school marketing executive. He was an ad man, helping Sega push the products they designed and manufactured upon the lucrative North American market. If the $300 Sega CD was a flop or the Game Gear kinda sucked, it really wasn't his fault, just as much as the quality of Sonic the Hedgehog as a game and the excellent Sega Genesis weren't really his accomplishments. Tom Kalinske was paid to sell the stuff, not create it. But it's precisely when Tom Kalinske's SEGA of America decided to get into the business of actually creating stuff that the biggest problems really began. At this point, I was tempted to discuss the fact that Tom Kalinske's tenure at Sega seems to overlap perfectly with the creation of the Sega Technical Institute, an attempt led by Mark Cerny to create Sega games in the United States, tailor-made for a Western audience. However, the origins of the Sega Technical Institute predate Kalinske's arrival at Sega by months. Indeed, it was Kalinske's predecessor, Michael Katz, who worked with Cerny to get a domestic game development team going. Kalinske simply appealed to Japan for funding to expand something that was clearly already started. That being said, the Sega Technical Institute's entire lifespan corresponds almost perfectly with Tom Kalinske's time at Sega. Technically, STI's first game under Cerny was Dick Tracy, which was developed back in 1990 and released in January of 1991. At this point, Kalinske would have been with Sega for only a few months. STI's last game was the ill-fated Sonic Extreme, a 3D Sonic game that was never released for the Sega Saturn and was cancelled late in 1996, the same year that Tom Kalinske would leave the company. So while I can't really give Tom Kalinske credit for coming up with the Sega Technical Institute, as the president of SEGA of America throughout the entirety of its existence, Kalinske does bear the bulk of the responsibility for its performance, which was actually quite bad. Between 1990 and 1996, the Sega Technical Institute managed to produce 6 domestic games for the Sega Genesis, on its own, and without the help of Sega of Japan. And really, none of their games were all that great. Mark Cerny's original goal was to bring Japanese and US teams together in one place, to learn from each other, but the two groups never got along, and STI split between the US developers and a team of Japanese developers led by Yuji Naka that focused entirely on Sonic games. STI's first game that went into development during Tom Kalinske's tenure was Kid Chameleon, a highly polarizing game even among Sega fans. Some people really enjoyed this ambitious yet unpolished platformer. Others simply can't get past how amateurish and dull the game is. It has good ideas, but I'm not sure anyone was terribly motivated to get a Genesis because of this game in 1992. Green Dog was STI's third game and also released in 1992, and this game is much worse than Kid Chameleon, and has become something of a meme in the retro gaming community, thanks largely to Joe from GameSack.
Green Dog!
Sonic Spinball was next in 1993, and boy is this game awful. It's basically ruined by slowdown and a horrific frame rate, though I do like the music and the neato pinball design using the Sonic character. 1995 saw two more games, both of which were easily the most interesting games ever developed by STI. You had Comic Zone, a side-scrolling beat-em-up set in a comic book come to life, and The Ooze, an overhead action game with the unique premise of being a green gelatinous puddle out to get revenge on an evil corporation. Neither game is truly exceptional, but there's no denying that they were refreshingly novel and ambitious offerings. Sadly, both games were released late in the Genesis's lifespan, at a time when people's attention had shifted heavily over to the PlayStation, Saturn, and N64, so they weren't really that popular. STI famously spent years working on their final game, Sonic Extreme, which was supposed to be released on the Sega Saturn. The game was plagued with costly setbacks and then completely canceled at the end of 1996. Sonic Extreme's failure to exist not only greatly hindered the struggling Saturn, which desperately needed hit games that appealed to Sega's core fanbase, but it probably also led to the end of the Sega Technical Institute itself. STI was shut down in 1996, again, the very same year that Tom Kalinske left the company. Is all of this a coincidence? I'm really not so sure. The Sega Technical Institute is a perfect example of how, in spite of pooling together a collection of talented young people and dumping money up their feet, you're not necessarily going to get anything valuable out of that same group of people without good direction and solid leadership. As the president of SEGA of America from the end of 1990 through 1996, STI was overwhelmingly Tom Kalinske's personal responsibility, and therefore its almost total failure to produce any hit Genesis games throughout its history falls squarely on his shoulders. But to be fair, Kalinske was not a game developer. He wasn't even a gamer. Kalinske was a marketing expert, and thus he was stuck in the mindset of wanting to coax the American public to buy products, in spite of the quality or usefulness of the product in question. That's how he got his start as a businessman. In 1968, he worked for an ad agency that created the Flintstones chewable vitamins concept for Miles Laboratories. When he was hired by Mattel and given the responsibility of boosting the sales of the languishing Barbie product line, it was for his merits as an ad man, not as a toy maker. Kalinske put out a cheaper version of Barbie, alongside tiers of increasingly more expensive versions, and had the dolls packaged in their now iconic pink boxes. That was his contribution. Price points and packaging, according to his own testimony, and he never talks about the quality of the actual dolls. If Sega was in the business of selling ketchup popsicles, and some Japanese dude decided to make Kalinske the president and CEO of the ketchup popsicle company on the beach, then he would have been just as excited, and he would have made all the same moves. First, he would have cut the price of the ketchup popsicle, because doing so means selling more ketchup popsicles, and you definitely want your name and legacy associated with an uptick in sales. Second, he probably would have altered the ketchup popsicle's packaging. You know, make sure it's cool and stands out on a shelf. Finally, he would have marketed ketchup popsicles to some target demographic, maybe the lactose intolerant, but at no point was he gonna stop and suggest a better flavor of popsicle. The flavor is beside the point, and realistically, that was Kalinske's approach to games as well. While Comic Zone and The Ooze failed to appeal that strongly to gamers in 1995, you'd better believe that the advertising for both of those games in the magazines was numerous and awesome. But if Kalinske really had cared about games, then he would have looked at the output of STI and seen that it was highly problematic. If Kalinske cared about the actual product, then he would have stepped in and made changes. If Kalinske really understood his own industry, he would have understood the long-term limitations of the Sega Genesis, and he would have avoided splitting his own market with the release of the 32X in 1994, the single biggest mistake ever made by Sega. Tom Kalinske was instrumental in Sega's decision to produce the $150 32X, an add-on that was intended to make the popular Sega Genesis competitive with next-gen consoles by greatly enhancing the technical capabilities of the aging hardware. Tom Kalinske was concerned that the Sega Genesis still had a viable future, and he feared that the $400 price point of the Sega Saturn being developed by SEGA of Japan was too high for American consumers. So the 32X was SEGA of America's proposed compromise. Just as Kalinske proposed cost tiers for the Barbie doll at Mattel, the 32X would be a low-cost option for Americans unwilling to buy a Sega Saturn. And so the 32X was designed by SEGA of America's research and development team and released worldwide by the end of 1994. There were major problems with this decision, however. First off, the 32X was, like the failed Sega CD that came before it, dependent upon the pre-existence of the Genesis. Thus, the market potential for the 32X was restricted solely to people who already owned that console. That was well less than 30 million potential sales in 1994. Realistically, game developers would have recognized that only a fraction of those tens of millions of people were actually going to buy a 32X for any reason. And realistically, game developers knew that their software would only appeal to a fraction of that fraction. So guess what game developers did? They ignored the 32X. Only 36 games were ever released for the console in the US, about half of which were either produced or developed by Sega, and very few original games were made for the console. Its library consisted almost entirely of ports of games that were already popular on other hardware, even games that already existed on the $100 Sega Genesis itself. In other words, developers weren't really willing to take a chance on the 32X with its relatively tiny market potential, but I think SEGA of America's research and development probably came up with the 32X in 1993 when sales of the Genesis were still really brisk. I think maybe they falsely inferred that sales would be brisk into the distant future. That was a goof, but it wasn't the only goof. They still ought to have considered the other problem with the 32X: competition. And worst of all, we're talking about competition with Sega's own brand. Not only was the 32X set up to compete against the Sony PlayStation in 1995, and eventually the N64, but it was also in direct competition with Sega of Japan's Saturn, which had been in development long before the 32X. Again, game developers were aware of this. They were also aware that the Saturn's CD-based technology offered them greater creative potential and much cheaper production costs over the 32X cartridges, which only reinforced the almost total lack of interest in the 32X on the part of developers. But this also had the effect of harming the Sega Saturn's potential by effectively splitting Sega's market into two camps. It was expected that of the tens of millions of Sega players, a certain percentage would prefer the $150 32X, and that a certain percentage of wealthier and more dedicated gamers would prefer the $400 Sega Saturn. From the point of view of developers, this presented a problem. Why develop games for Sega at all when Sega's fanbase was split between two competing consoles? Further, Sega's internal development teams were tied up trying to launch two successful consoles at the exact same time. Sega AM2 had to port Virtua Fighter to the 32X, but they also rushed to port Virtua Fighter to the Saturn. Indeed, that was their pack-in game for the console. However, the Saturn port had major problems, and Sega had to reissue free replacements of Virtua Fighter, which were eventually called Virtua Fighter Remix, to all registered Saturn owners months after the console's launch. Can you imagine how costly that was? Meanwhile, Sonic Team was tied up developing Knuckles Chaotix for the 32X, and yet there was no Sonic game available for the Saturn at launch. The 32X had cannibalized Sega's capacity to produce must-have games for their own consoles, which previously had always been one of their strongest attributes as a company. Can you imagine how much better things may have been for the Sega Saturn if Tom Kalinske and Sega of America had not pushed for a 32X add-on? Developers would have invested in a single formidable pool of Sega gamers. Virtua Fighter would have gotten full-time oversight, and maybe there would have even been a better game coming from Sonic Team for the Saturn had they not been tied down with Knuckles on the 32X. But it was even worse than that, because as predicted, a sizable number of Genesis owners did in fact purchase a 32X in the late fall of 1994, and after that same demographic put down $150 for early access to next-gen gaming, only to find out that after months and months and months of waiting, there was never going to be any good games to justify their investment, and indeed that Sega was already rolling out the Saturn in May of the following year. They were burned, man, and they were burned hard. The failure of the 32X lost Sega a lot of loyal customers, permanently. and it greatly cheapened Sega's formerly cool kid image. If the Genesis was a slick hat trick that got tens of millions of people on board with the Sega brand, then the antidote to that was Sega's endless litany of failed hardware. The Game Gear, the Nomad, the Sega CD, and of course the 32X. And they even announced at one point the Neptune, which was a standalone 32X. And then of course there was the poor Sega Saturn, that was tied down by the fact that by 1995, Sega was regarded as greedy and possibly stupid. Indeed, Sega never fully recovered from their losses in the mid-90s. The seeds of the company's demise were sown. Did you know that the 32X required a separate power supply alongside the Genesis? You had to wrestle with two AC adapters simultaneously. Who in the hell thought that that was a good idea? These guys, that's who. But as bad as the 32X was, and it really was the worst kind of trash, it really wasn't Tom Kalinsche's idea. That blame usually goes to Joe Miller at SEGA of America Research and Development, or Hayao Nakayama for wanting to rush Sega into the next generation. But all the same, Kalinske believed in it, pushed for it, and tried to make it work. But it's hard to imagine anyone who knows gaming getting behind the 32X. After all, where were the games? How can you promote a console when it lacks games that make owning it worthwhile? Could you imagine Nintendo greenlighting a 32X? What's that? Nintendo launched the Virtual Boy the following year? Never mind. But remember dudes, Kalinske is an adman and not a game developer. Flintstones vitamins, pink Barbie boxes, 32Xs, catch-up popsicles. It's all just product that needs to be moved, and moving product is a function of how it's displayed, not so much what it is. That's the mindset of the adman. And that's what Tom Kalinske is, and as such, the one brand Kalinske sold better than all the others turned out to be his own. Because only a top-shelf adman could convince millions of people that after helping kill the Sega Saturn, that they were still the best thing that ever happened to the company. So, did Tom Kalinske save Sega? In the 90s, it sorta looked that way, for a time. Sega was kicking Nintendo's butt, and the dude managed to get the Genesis on the store shelves with big retailers like Walmart, which had previously been Nintendo exclusive territory. That's an amazing accomplishment, but a lot of the other stuff that Tom Kalinske touched, like the Sega Technical Institute, the 32X, and the infamously embarrassing launch of the Saturn in America, went absolutely horribly wrong. And these things also have to be counted as part of his total legacy. Did Tom Kalinske cause the Genesis to succeed? Or was it Sonic the Hedgehog, a game made by Sega in Japan? I'm inclined to think that the key decision was cutting the price of the Genesis and making Sonic the pack-in game. And as far as I know, that was Tom Kalinske's plan. And because of him, millions of people remain nostalgic for Sonic to this very day. Whereas in Japan, well, not so much. Sonic's never mattered as much over there. But at the same time, it's not obvious to me that this decision was profitable in the long run, or that it outweighs Kalinske's other less successful decisions. My view is this. Tom Kalinske was really only with Sega for about 5 years. And that was just long enough to take all of the credit, without having to take much of the blame for the failure of the company. As a salesman, Kalinske is truly one of the greats, but every great salesman knows that the first thing you've got to sell in every exchange is yourself. And Kalinske clearly understood that, and it explains why even 30 years later, we all still love to talk about the guy even though he's long since moved on and the company he worked for has long since been, essentially, buried in the ground. And partly thanks to Tom Kalinske. So what do you guys think about Tom Kalinske? Do you think he's the savior of Sega, or was he just another smiling corporate shill? Have you read Console Wars? Does this video make you want to buy catch-up popsicles? Should we get a sponsorship from Catch-Up Popsicles? Please let us know all this and more in the comments. Later, dudes!
Okay gang, ever since we launched those catch-up popsicles several months ago, sales have been below expectations.
Why would he say that?
Far below your expectations.
Wow.
What was that? That's what I thought. Anyway, let's discuss my 2-point plan for rescuing this product line. Part 1. We cut the price of catch-up popsicles. Part 2. We've modified the packaging. It used to come in plastic black clamshells with a white grid, but research shows that these look too much like proper video game boxes. So we've come up with an eye-popping red cardboard box instead.
Mr. Kalinske? I have a question, dude.
Oh yes, Bradley? And what's that?
Why don't we just sell something other than ketchup popsicles? 'Cause they kinda suck.
Oh, Bradley, you're fired.
Oh, bummer.